Welcome to Tell the Damn Story, the show that explores the many ways to navigate the successes and failures that aspiring and struggling writers face to make your journey that much easier.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Chris Ryan, hybrid author, and that is Alex Simmons. He is a legendary author, and we're here today on Tell the Damn Story to use our experiences to make your writer's journey easier and more enjoyable. And ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to talk to you about comedy. Hi, how you doing? It's Chris Ryan. That's Alex Simmons. And we do want to talk about writing comedy. As a matter of fact, Alex, if I remember correctly, sir, someone asked you.
Yes, they often
Right?
do this.
So this
They
is a
often do
request,
this.
ladies and gents.
Yes. So what's going to happen here, folks, is, and we are going to talk about comedy. We're going to talk about writing comedy. In particular, it was inspired by a question that I get every now and then from some of my screenwriting students in particular, but from some other writers that I'm working with. How do you write funny? How do you write comedy, funny bits and things like that? And they usually what happens is the students have tried to write something funny and gotten jammed up, and then of course I don't hear from them for a week, and then they show up in class and they agree, I couldn't write, it wasn't funny, I couldn't think of anything funny. And I have to help them by saying this. First and foremost, there are people who are gag writers. Comedy is just what they do, is what they live and what they breathe, and funny thoughts just come to them just like instantly, and they're writing like crazy. There are a few folks like that, but the vast majority of writers, your first job, whether you're a seasoned pro or just emerging, is to get the concept, the idea, the plot, the story out, get the characters out of your head onto a surface, and then find the humor in the circumstance or in the character organically.
Right.
And that's where I tend to start my process of helping people write humor or comedy scenes, situations, or stories.
And I would point out that the gag writers you were talking about would just have funny coming out of them. They have funny coming out of them because they studied funny for a long time, and that they have been working at funny since like fourth grade.
Yeah, not
right?
sooner. Yeah,
Whereas George Carlin has that great line that in the classroom, it's always an easier gig because you're not supposed to be funny. If you whip a look on Johnny and then turn around quick, Johnny's going to get caught laughing, always hysterical. Not the same thing as writing gags, but recognizing the funny. And you don't want to walk around your family reunions going, hey, I tried that, doesn't work really well.
Yeah,
and
they
I
don't
haven't been
invite you
invited
back a lot.
Yeah, but building off your idea that the initial premise, I don't think we write funny. I think we rewrite funny, right?
Yep.
We get a
Yeah.
premise that could work, and then it's in developing it, that's where it goes. And it ties in, speaking of George Carlin, with his explanation of where humor comes from. Paraphrasing loosely, but he said jokes or humor usually go one or two ways. It's always a factual or believable premise, and then the punchline is either wildly absurd or such a sharp surprise to the left or the right of the premise that it tickles humor, right? And that's applicable in almost everything we find funny.
Let's start back a little bit in terms of because you mentioned George Carlin, and we will come back to George several times, trust me. But both of us have written funny things or funny stories and things like that. But you at one point were a writer with a improv or comedy group.
It was a sketch comedy troupe. It was called the South Soul Comedy Troupe, and I was a co-founder with two stand-up comedians, Herb Quinones and Rich Ramirez. And then I wound up being the head writer, mostly because I was the quickest at taking notes, not because of any innate genius. But the whole idea was to approach sketch writing, even classical sketch writing, from a Latino flavor. So Rich came in one time with, I forget the name of the premise. It was like Macarena Man or something like that. It was a Latino or Hispanic Superman. So what would that be like? And they just piled on cultural ideas. And we just used the structure of a George Reeves episode of Superman. So we would build in some humor from that. Superman would be, it's him and Lois Lane, and Lois would be like, he's just a Clark, you're such a, and then he'd go out and, oh, Merengue Man, that was the name of the character.
Merengue Man. Okay.
Merengue Man. And then he would come to, the gunman would show up or whatever, and he'd come to defeat the gunman, and he would use merengue inspired, and they would do all those different things. Like you'd see Superman hit a guy, and the classic George Reeves, the guy would empty the gun at Superman, and he would stand there and
Right.
and then he would throw the gun at Superman, and Superman would duck.
That made no sense, right?
Because the bullets weren't really coming to George Reeves, but the gun was coming towards his head.
Yeah.
So they would do that stuff, and then Merengue would be playing whenever he was. So it just built the absurdities of a merengue-powered Superman. That's where the premise came from. But that's where the funny came from. But the premise was a superhero, a superhero like old-time TV show, and then we'll just give it a cultural spin. Another one we did almost entirely from improv was we were coming in and taking our coats off and just talking, and Herb and an actress in the troupe were oil and water. So I leaned over to Rich and said, we got to get those two on a blind date. We improv that. Or maybe Rich said it to me. It's been 2 decades. So we just put it in a situation where they had to meet, and we just said to the actress, I'm so sorry for, it's not Malena Forte. It was another really gifted character actress, and I'm forgetting her name. I'm sorry. Just let her be her outrageous character self. And Herb was going to be just him, his long dreads, a short, funny, funny oozed off him, but he was going to just try all his lines on her.
Okay.
As funny as Herb was, he was still in the factual side of the equation, right? What would be called in comedic writing the straight person, right? The one who sets up the joke, the premise person, and then she reacted. And then once they started going, it was everything I could do to write notes quick enough. And then we wound up with so much stuff. We get to the next thing we're going to suggest, which is let it suck, write it, write all you can, all the ideas you can, and then it's a matter of paring it down. What actually works when you do it a couple of times, what joke still has power, what supports the premise of the piece, what seems to be likely that that character would say, and you keep polishing until you have the piece. I want to go to you for a comparative analysis. Okay. Here's what we mean by what would be supported by the characters, what works, right? Okay. So, Alex, you have written stories, comic book stories about a spooky, ghostly presence that has to be dealt with. Okay?
Yeah.
When you've written Batman, how would he handle that?
Very differently.
Very seriously, right?
Very seriously. Yes.
Even
technologically, or as a matter of fact, there have been Batman stories where he's dealt with the supernatural and it's not been funny.
No, it's not been funny. Even if it's like the Joker or the Riddler or somebody absurd, it was always played for the thrills rather than laughs.
Yep.
Now, same premise. some kind of spooky premise, causing trouble, presence causing trouble. You've also written this cast of characters.
Yes, I have.
Scooby-Doo.
Absolutely.
Is it a different tone than Batman?
Absolutely.
Why?
Probably completely and forever because
Why?
once again, it's the characters. When one looks at the premise of setting up a story where you have an antagonist, a villain of some sort, doing nefarious things or terrible things, and then you have your heroic protagonist characters coming in, if it's a Batman or someone who's more serious, then they're going to approach it one way. You can find some humor in a situation, but it's not meant to be funny.
Right.
The idea is the storyline is not meant to be funny. But with Scooby Doo, it's definitely about funny. It's definitely about absurd. It's definitely about laughs. And looking at the characters, I'd grown up watching the show, but when I finally was actually writing the comic books, looking at the characters, you have to get to know who's your source for the most laughs and how
Right.
do the other characters play off of that. So when you look at the cast, you have Fred, who's the gallant, fearless leader. He's the heroic figure. He's the muscular guy. He's the one who looks. He's a handsome guy. He's also got a bit of a crush on Daphne. Daphne is a heroine character, but she is not funny. She is more.
Very
I'm going to react.
serious.
She's a little bit like a watered down Nancy Drew, that sort of thing. Velma is supposedly the brilliant member of the
Right.
team. She's a smart girl with all the information and she knows what to read and she can put some gadgets together. And that's her shtick. Shaggy and Scooby are the laughs.
They are
Yep.
cowards.
Yep.
They might be high,
Constantly. Because they are
right?
munching
And
down on anything
and
they can
they
find.
have the munchies.
Yep.
The middle
Munchies.
thing
Yep.
never overtly admitted to.
No.
You never saw them smoke a joint, none of that
No.
stuff. But their behavior, going to get a snack or this or that, made
And the
that
amount of snacks that they could consume.
again,
Yes.
going for a premise, we're hungry, and then being way absurd about it.
Yep.
A
A
Dagwood
15 decker
sandwich,
sandwich or
right?
whatever. Yeah.
And the
But again,
idea that they were cowards, always funny and always endearing to us.
and again, the reality there was they were either going to hide, run, or stumble across the villain, but either way, they were not going to be the takedown artists per se. Oh, and a lot of times in the early episodes, they were used as bait
Right,
for the creature or the villain, the ghostly character to chase them
right.
into one of Fred's traps. And quite often the trap didn't work initially quite right, so they got to run even more.
Or they would slide across on some mishap of the trap and
Yeah,
slam into the ghoul whose mask would come off, and
right. And then you see what's really going on.
still humor based.
Right. But the reality again is knowing your characters, knowing the circumstances and finding the humor, developing the humor within that.
Right.
And any number of the Scooby premises, if you really look at them, if you really just do a thumbnail sketch or a 2 sentence or 3 sentence premise of each of these episodes, you're gonna find that you can find that same premise in a CSI episode,
Yeah, yeah.
or in this NCIS or any cop shows or some of the dramatic
Yeah.
shows. You're gonna find that same premise, but it's how it's handled. It
And
goes
it
back to what we said at the beginning. Get your ideas, get your concepts down first, and then find the humor in it. What were you going to
and
start?
it also underscores the George Carlin formula that the premise is serious.
Yeah.
And then the punchline is something exaggerated behavior or really surprising behavior that would, you know,
Yeah.
it could be surprising behavior, but if it's a Klan rally burning across, that's not going to get you to humor, right?
No, but funny you should mention that.
But if Richard Pryor joins the
Yes.
Klan,
Yeah.
funny.
Right. In a movie, yes. In a movie, yes. With
Right.
walking along the country road at night by himself in a circumstance where his bus is broken down, he's upset, he's pissed off, and from behind him out of the woods comes a line of Klansmen, and how he reacts when he sees them, even in his reaction, that is meant to play for humor.
Yeah.
Because obviously, a black man out in the woods at night turns around and sees 8 or 10 Klansmen in the robes. He's not going to be funny. It's not going to
Right.
go down that way. But when it's designed to be humorous, then you play for your character's
Right.
reactions and how the scenario then plays out is where you find the laughs.
Excellent. Can we go to a second bit of advice?
Certainly.
This we're going to use John Cleese, very great.
We're going to go across the pond now.
Yes, great comedian, great writer, great actor from Monty Python, a legendary comedy troupe. One of the things he always said is that you have to remember as the comedian or as the writer that the humor is not for you. It's for the audience. So you always play it straight. And then the comedy comes from the audience's reaction to it. So for example, we're going to use a very straight, serious premise. A customer comes to a store to return an item that he is very disappointed with. Not funny premise.
No, not so far.
It's a pet store.
Still not funny.
Not funny. There's only the pet shop owner and the customer. Still not funny.
No, not a cast of thousands either.
What the customer is returning is a parrot. Still not funny. Very factual business transaction. The parrot was sold to him dead.
Okay.
Now we're starting to get, because you notice it went from factual to absurd, right? And then we start seeing the genius writing skills of Monty Python, because they take this very serious, easy premise, and the owner is I think he was like a Cockney or Welsh or some kind of street accent, and the store owner a bit more sophisticated. And you have him coming in fairly pleasant, saying, you sold me a dead parrot. You have the owner saying, no, he's just tired. The patron gets a little angry and argues that he's not, he is dead. No, he was just resting. And it goes up till John Cleese, very seriously, he never laughs. There's 30 years later in a reunion, they laughed a little bit, but that was a different context. But in the piece itself, very serious, and his outrage gets the better out of him till he's hysterically speechifying. This parrot has ceased to be. He's cut off the moral coil. He's joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-parrot. Humor, right? So it's a great textbook example of taking serious premise and then going further and further with the absurdity. And these were new characters for these two actors, but they committed to the seriousness of their character's position, as absurd as it was. And that's where you get the humor. It wasn't for it was for the audience to say, my God, that's ridiculous, and start laughing. When you're writing, ladies and gents, get your straight premise and then start asking, who's in this scene? And who would be funny? We talked about this in the green room, where you were like, you could very easily go, listen, that parent wasn't dead when I sold it to you, and
that's it.
I can't help you. And the scene ends. But that they had the discussion in the store, and then he was able to quote the store owner saying, you said he was just resting. He is. And off it goes. Then you can build humor.
And another thing too is because we talk about rewrites a lot in anything we talk about in terms of writing. Rewrites are your friends. Rewrites are your friends. In developing humor or humorous situations in a story, or developing comedy scripts or improv, it's about doing it over and building on it and refining it and finding those moments and honing those moments. You had talked about in the green room, you had talked about the writer's room, and how, again, a group of people sitting around throwing out ideas, bouncing ideas off each other, writing them down. You and the South Soul comedy troupe, ideas throwing around, writing them down as fast as you can, writing out a full script, playing that script in a, getting everybody up on their feet, rolling through it,
and
finding out
tearing it
what
apart.
connects, what
Yeah,
doesn't, right?
yeah,
And you can rework, if you're doing stand up or you're doing improv groups or comedy groups, you can rework it within the confines of rehearsal. But it isn't until you're out in front of an audience that you really find out
yeah,
what's working and what doesn't.
yeah,
And I think Seinfeld, at least it's attributed to him that he has this rule about if you want to be a comedy writer, write a joke every day. You
right,
know, he doesn't say write a great joke every day. He doesn't say write a good joke every day. He says write a joke every day
right. And
because it's the practice of looking at material, looking at ideas, looking at experiences, and writing things down, and then attempting to shape it into the effect that you want. In this case,
yeah.
humorous.
And you could go and pick up a book that he wrote or put out. It was all his old stand-up material he wasn't going to use anymore. It was stuff that he had used over the years, and then he had done a Netflix special or something that was called "I'm Telling You This for the Last Time," right? And that was quasi true because he put it in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and the book he titled "Is This Anything?" And he explained that's what comics say to each other, comedians say to each other. They have a premise or they think they have a joke, and they'll tell it to their one of their colleagues and say, "Is this anything?" Or say, "Is this anything?" and then try it on them, and then it would play. Seinfeld famously worked with Larry David to create the Seinfeld show, and when they first started, it's a show about nothing. It would be just these 30 somethings who had refused to grow up in there. But somewhere along the line, George Costanza's got parents that were put on the show. And then those characters were so absurd. You get a character as absurd as George Costanza, and then you get his parents, and they are more absurd, right? Then you can really go places. And Larry David still is the ultimate curmudgeon, right? And he funneled a lot of that into different characters on the show. But when you get the father, Costanza's father, that's where you get the anti-Christmas or the anti-Hanukkah
Mm-hmm.
Festivus for
Yep.
the rest of us,
Yep.
right? And the airing of the grievances. And all of that is built on your characters. But it starts with the premise. Story, a show about nothing. It's just the life of a couple of friends in their 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes the characters. Who can do that? And that is something we've seen throughout the decades. Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, the Marx Brothers,
When you
Scooby
think
Doo,
when you think
on
about
and on it goes.
yeah, you think about how many James Bond movies there have been and how many different actors have played James Bond. You go through all of them. You go from Sean Connery to Roger Moore, and in between Timothy Dalton and
Daniel Craig,
Daniel Craig, and actually there's one other whose name I can't remember right now.
Timothy Hutton,
No, no, he was in the TV series.
Dalton,
No, Dalton. No, I can't believe I'm Pierce Brosnan. There we go, Pierce
Pierce
Brosnan.
Brosnan. Oh, yes,
Okay,
Pierce Brosnan.
so you have these different James Bond films from the 1960s to now to contemporary times, right? And some of the Roger Moores had humorous moments in it that was played for funny moments,
Right,
shtick in effect, but they were never really written as full comedies. Whereas when the Bond films first became popular and everybody was trying to churn out their various spy thrillers, you had The Man from Uncle and you had Secret Agent Man, again, played straight, maybe with a little humor in it, but then you had Get Smart
right.
and Don Adams, Get Smart. So now you've gone from this British agent who's lethal and a womanizer and tough as nails and all this kind of stuff, and these brutal people he goes up against, to this inept dude who could barely be a maitre d at a posh restaurant, and yet the fate of the free world
Yeah.
was often placed in his hands. Right?
And played often that parody element, taking a serious format and finding mining the humor
Absolutely.
in it. Austin
Milky.
Powers.
Yeah.
You know what? We'll use a very modern example, one that's in the theaters right now, and surprisingly offered as part of your Prime package if you have Prime. And that's the current holiday movie called Red One.
Ah, there you go.
Okay. Red One, simple premise. holiday movie for all ages. Okay, that's the genre. Premise: Santa Claus has been kidnapped. How are we going to save Christmas? No humor there, right? Who would be the best or the worst person to have to find this? Someone who doesn't believe in Santa.
Mm-hmm.
So the Chris Evans character. And he needs someone to play off. So you bring in The Rock, right? It was The Rock was probably there first. He produced this thing, but he is like a Secret Service protector for Santa. What else can we do? Let's play on all the Santa tropes. But if we view Santa not as a jolly old elf or whatever, but as a world treasure, a global treasure, like a superhero or like a
Celebrity superstar, something like
or
that.
a president or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Now you start playing. Oh, so then The Rock is like the Secret Service. Okay, what are we going to call? We'll call his organization ELF, EL, whatever it stands for, right? They need a villain. Let's go to the Christmas mythologies. Especially in Eastern Europe, there are a lot of anti-clauses, right? Santa gives presents, right? Krampus gives punishment, right? Greiler, another Christmas witch or winter witch, she punishes. So now you have two characters who don't believe, Santa who absolutely believes, two characters who believe the opposite of Santa, that punishment is needed. You have a wealth of opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And you can play on every Santa or Christmas tradition, every myth. That they have the headless horseman in there for a scene, and it works great. And then the idea, the one that ruins Christmas for so many kids, and adults, how can Santa possibly do all this in one night? And you give a plausible reason of how? Comedy gold. Played straight, remember John
Mm-hmm.
Cleese's maxim, but it winds up, Red One winds up being a surprisingly satisfying holiday, all ages film that is clever and funny and reinstills belief in a wonderful way. That's another way of writing comedy, character
So
based.
one of the things, again, in rounding this off, one of the things is obvious, and we'll say it again because some of you may not have taken notes at the beginning, is
Well,
once
that's why we
again,
have a rewind button.
yeah, you do not have to start out worrying about whether or not you can write funny. That's not your job. Your job is to get the
Rewrite funny.
story and the characters out, and then, as Chris just said, do it, develop it in the rewrites, find it in the rewrites. As you get to know the material and the characters better, find the humor in that. So that's one. The other thing I will say, it's a great, and this ties into the George Carlin maxim about going left or right in terms of absurdity, is come up with a premise, come up with the characters, and then say, what if? And the more you ask that question as you develop, the wilder things can become.
Yeah. And
Because
a
again,
version,
even what Chris was saying with the setup of Red One, yeah, you could have a bounty hunter or a private detective or whatever to find Santa Claus, and he doesn't believe in Santa Claus. Okay, fine. You could have stopped there, but he's going to need somebody to bounce off. So okay, so we'll get him an elf helper. Yeah, but what if the elf
was the
wasn't
problem.
a little person? What if? What if?
Yeah.
What if? What if? So that's a powerful thing for you. And sometimes, again, if you're trying to really go for humor, the wackier you let yourself go, don't judge the ideas, just jot them down. The wackier you go, the more ideas you have. And then, as we've often said, in rewrites and reconsidering the
Yeah.
material, looking at the material, you cherry pick the
Yeah.
pieces that are going to work for you.
A version of the what if is Would it be funny if, right? And then as far as the rewrite's concerned, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, those Saturday Night Live veterans and all that stuff, they take the rough draft, and say, all right, how can we pare it down? How can we say that line in less words
Mm-hmm.
to make it clearer and funnier? Because if your premise is 3 sentences long, it can be more complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to keep the premise pretty simple, but you want the punchline to be even more clear.
Mm-hmm.
Absurd, a surprise, but it can't be 4 paragraphs of dialogue to
Right.
get that punchline.
Yes,
That's,
because people will go out and make sandwiches before you
no,
reach it.
you could have Herb Keon has taught me the comedy rule of threes, and you can see that as a way you have a joke that's funny, a second one that is funnier, or a punchline that's funny, second punchline that's funnier, and then the third one that's funniest. You can do that. Do you remember Tim Allen? He played in Toy Story and stuff. He had his own sitcom. He used to play with that. Same thing with Steve Martin. They would do the comedy rule of threes and then keep hammering at it till 13, 14, 15. And it was a real risk, because the fourth is diminishing returns. By the time you get 7, it's not funny anymore. By the time you get to 9, it's almost painful. But like 10, 11, 12, 13 gets so absurd that it gets funnier again.
Yeah.
So there's a million ways to do
Oh, it's
it.
funny too because Tim
You got
Allen
to
in the
rewrite.
Santa Claus.
I'm sorry, sir?
Tim Allen played
Was
Santa in
Santa
the
Claus.
Santa Claus. So
And
there's
Santa
another
Claus 2.
Santa reference there. Yeah.
All right, there you go. See
Another.
how we kept it holiday for
Yeah,
you?
yeah, yeah.
Hey,
Here we
hey,
go. Yeah,
hey.
and over his shoulder. There you go.
Yeah, I got to talk about this
Yeah,
because this is not part, this is our commercial.
yeah.
This
Right.
episode is
Let's go for a
sponsored
commercial break.
by, this is Soul Scream Anthologine, Come All Ye Faithless. The first version of it came out last Christmas and it had about 4 stories in it. This is the expanded version. It's got somewhere between 12 and 16. It's much more in there. Some humor, just keeping the theme of today. But it's available now in ebook and print. $4.99 for the ebook, $9.99 for the print book. I'd probably go ebook to get it and be able to read it in time for Christmas. But all the profits, all the proceeds from it up through December, so I guess New Year's Eve, will go to the ACLU. So we're going to do some donations here. If you haven't checked it out, check it out.
Check it out.
It's
Check
a
it out.
lot of stuff there for you. Some of Krampus makes a point, goes up. The Yule Cat, there's a lot of the mythology we played around with. Krampus shows up 2 different times. One at the hands of T.L. James Glenn, hilarious. So there you go. And back to our
Yes, we're
episode.
back. We're back, and we're still rounding it off here by
Yes.
again coming back to the fact that writing comedy or writing humorous instances in your stories can be done, and it's not the kind of task that you have to be a funny person initially to do it, but it's finding the humor in the moments or in the characters and identifying which characters will deliver that humor most
Right.
effectively. All right.
And the best way to develop your sense of funny is to watch a lot of fun
Yeah.
and rewatch it and watch what they do and how they do it. We were talking about some people just have it and all that stuff. Even the people who just have it planned it and developed it.
Mm.
There's that, I think it's at the Improv, Robin Williams at the Improv, his first stand-up thing. And he says, it looks like he just comes out, he says a million things all over the place, blah, 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 blah. But the producer and one of the extras says, when he came to the Improv to record that, he says, okay, so I'm going to start here. I'm going to do my this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to go into the audience for the Shakespeare bit. And you realize he has all these things worked out and rehearsed and practiced down to where he's going to be in the club when he says these lines. And then he does it in a very practiced way that allows him to seem 100% spontaneous. Sometimes he'll pick up a prop for a woman's scarf or this or that. That's improv. But he has developed the core of the material and then performs it as organically. We write the material and no one sees the rewrites. This ain't no math problem. You don't show the work. You show the finished product.
Yeah.
So go ahead and then
Rewrite it again. Yeah.
I love rewrite.
Okay.
It's like
All right,
Neil
well,
Simon. He used to say if there was a problem when they got this, he had like a soft comedy taste for plays. And if something didn't work, he'd be like, I know how to fix that. And he'd run to the typewriter. That was his reputation because he loved rewriting.
And again, it's funny you should mention him. And again, I know we're trying to say goodbye here, but we'll just quickly say
Those long goodbyes, ladies and gents.
in Neil Simon's his whole thing was taking commonplace, everyday kind of scenarios and then turning them into enjoyable two-act, marvelous, humorous, or comedy plays.
He
And
would say, give me two people who are opposite each other and put them in a room. I have a play for you.
And Barefoot in the Park was one of those situations. A young married couple move into this ridiculously tiny, absurd apartment up on the fifth or the top floor of this old building with these absurd neighbors. And what can happen? And that's what he did. He built it out of that. But it's basically two people get married and they move into their first apartment. Is that funny?
I mean,
no.
You can explain The Odd Couple, a slob and a neat freak move in together.
Yeah.
Not funny.
Yes.
What happened? Funny.
Yeah, exactly. So finding those moments in your work is the work of the rewrites. Start out by getting the ideas down first. Chris, as always, thank you. Oh, Chris, what should people do who have benefited from this time with us?
Ladies and gentlemen, since we've imparted all this absolutely priceless information and the secrets of comedy gold, the least you can do is hit and subscribe.
Yeah, ho, ho, ho. Take care, everybody.
All right, peace, everyone.